Implied status in Canada for visitors, students, and workers. Implied status in Canada refers to a legal provision that allows individuals who have applied to extend or change their status as a visitor, student, or worker to continue to stay in Canada under their previous status while they wait for a decision on their application. This provision helps ensure that individuals can remain in the country without having to leave and re-enter or face the risk of overstaying. Implied status is a key feature of Canada's immigration system, allowing for greater flexibility and continuity in the legal status of temporary residents. Understanding implied status. Implied status comes into play when a person's permit, visitor, student, or work expires, and they have already applied for a renewal or change of status. For instance, if a student's study permit expires and they have applied to extend it, they can continue studying in Canada under the same conditions as their expired study permit until a decision is made on their application. Similarly, workers and visitors can continue their activities as long as they applied for an extension before their current status expired. The core concept of implied status is that an individual's legal status is implied to continue while waiting for the application to be processed. However, the status is only valid as long as the application is made before the original permit's expiration. If an application is filed after the expiry date, the applicant loses implied status and is considered to be out of status in Canada. Visitor status for visitors in Canada. Implied status allows them to stay in the country legally if their visitor visa expires, but they have already submitted an application to extend it. Visitors can continue to stay in Canada without being at risk of overstaying, provided they stay within the boundaries of the original conditions of their visa. For example, if the visitor's visa was for a short-term visit, they cannot start working or studying during the period of implied status unless authorized. However, it's important to note that implied status does not grant new rights beyond the original visa conditions. If the original visa allowed for a short visit, the visitor cannot switch to another status, such as applying to become a student or a worker, without filing the proper applications. Visitors can only remain as visitors under implied status until their application for extension or change of status is processed. Student status. Implied status is especially crucial for international students. If a student's study permit expires and they apply to extend it before it lapses, they can continue studying under the same conditions as their previous permit until their new permit is issued. The student can stay in Canada without having to leave the country during the processing period, ensuring that their academic progress is not interrupted. Students must ensure that they meet the conditions of their original study permit, even while under implied status. For example, if the original study permit was issued with conditions like enrollment in a designated learning institution and maintaining full-time status, these conditions must continue to be met for the duration of the implied status. It is also essential for students to ensure that their study permit extension application is filed before their original permit expires. If the application is filed after expiry, implied status is not granted, and the student will be considered out of status, which could affect future immigration applications and plans to extend or change their status. Worker status. For workers, implied status allows individuals who have applied to extend their work permit to continue working in Canada under the same conditions as their original work permit until a decision is made. This ensures that employees can remain employed without facing legal consequences or requiring a temporary departure from the country. Like with students and visitors, workers must apply for an extension or a new permit before their current work permit expires in order to benefit from implied status. In the case of a worker applying to change employers or to modify the terms of their work, they can continue working under the same conditions as the old work permit until the new permit is approved. This provides stability for both the worker and their employer, as the worker does not need to stop working during the application process. However, if the application is not filed before the permit expires, the worker loses their implied status and may need to leave Canada or face legal consequences for staying without valid status. Limitations of implied status. While implied status allows individuals to remain in Canada legally while their application is being processed, there are some key limitations and conditions. 1. No change in conditions. Implied status only allows individuals to continue with the same activities permitted under their original status. For example, a visitor cannot start studying or working, and a worker cannot change employers without the appropriate authorization. 2. Waiting for approval. Implied status only remains valid while an application is in progress. If the application is denied, the individual will lose their implied status and may be required to leave Canada. 3. No automatic work or study authorization. In cases where an individual applies for a new type of permit, such as a student applying to switch to a work permit, implied status does not automatically allow them to start working or studying under the new conditions until a new permit is granted. 4th, loss of implied status. If an individual leaves Canada while under implied status, they lose their implied status. To re-enter Canada, they would need to apply for a new visa or permit. 5. Processing delay. Implied status does not extend indefinitely. If an application takes too long to process, the person may find themselves in a situation where their implied status is no longer valid. In Canada, implied status refers to the situation where a visitor, student, or worker has applied for an extension or renewal of their temporary status, such as a visitor visa, study permit, or work permit, before their current status expires. During the processing period of the application, the individual is considered to have implied status, meaning they can continue staying in Canada under the same conditions as their original permit until a decision is made, even if the permit itself has expired. Here's a breakdown of the main categories. 1. Visitors. If a visitor applies for an extension of their visitor visa before it expires, they can stay in Canada under implied status while their extension application is being processed. However, they cannot engage in activities not allowed by their visitor status, e.g., work or study, during this period. Students. If a study permit holder applies for an extension before the permit expires, they can continue studying under implied status. If the permit expires during processing, they can continue their studies until a decision is made, provided they applied for an extension before the permit expired. Workers. Similarly, if a worker applies for a work permit extension before their current work permit expires, they are allowed to keep working in Canada under implied status while awaiting a decision on their application. This applies to temporary workers, but not to those without valid work authorization, who begin working without an approved permit. It is important to note that implied status only applies if the individual has maintained legal status in Canada and has applied for an extension before their current status expired. If the application is denied, the individual would no longer have implied status and must leave Canada. It seems like your message got cut off. Were you asking for further clarification or more details regarding implied status, or perhaps referring to a different aspect? Let me know how I can help. It seems like your message got cut off. Were you asking for further clarification or more details regarding implied status, or perhaps referring to a different aspect? Let Me King Canada, visitors, students, and workers all fall under specific categories of temporary residents, each governed by different regulations based on their status. Here's an overview of each.